The dust devil spiraled across Prosperity's main street, like a brown ghost carrying with it the acrid smell of fear. And something else, something metallic that made the horses stamp nervously at their hitching posts. Hazel Moore clutched her baby closer to her chest, feeling Tommy's feverish body burning through his thin blanket as she stumbled toward the market square. The morning sun blazed mercilessly overhead, turning the wooden buildings into furnaces and the packed earth into a griddle that cracked under every step. "Please," she whispered to Mrs. Henderson at the vegetable stand, her voice cracking like old leather. "Just a potato. Tommy hasn't eaten in 2 days." The woman's face twisted with disgust as she took in Hazel's torn dress, her unwashed hair the desperate hollow of her cheeks. "We don't serve your kind here." Mrs. Henderson spat, turning her back with theatrical flourish. "Find yourself a husband instead of begging like some common." She said no. The voice cut through the square like a whip crack. Sheriff Finch emerged from the barber shop, his badge catching the light as he adjusted his gun belt with practiced ease. His pale eyes swept over Hazel with something that might have been recognition, quickly masked by professional indifference. "Move along, woman. You're disturbing decent folk." Hazel met his gaze for just a moment, long enough to catch something familiar in the set of his jaw, the way his left eye twitched when he was angry. Just like their mother used to. She shook her head, dismissing the impossible thought. "Sheriff, my baby is sick. I just need—" I said, "Move along." His hand dropped to his gun butt, fingers drumming a rhythm she remembered from childhood. 3 quick taps, pause, 3 more. The gesture sent ice through her veins, despite the blazing heat. From the edge of the square, Wicasa watched the exchange with eyes that missed nothing. The Lakota man stood like a shadow against the trading post wall, his weathered face impassive, as the white customers stepped around him as if he were invisible. But his gaze tracked every movement, cataloged every cruel word, every turned back. When Hazel's baby let out a weak cry that carried across the square, something shifted in his expression, a flash of old pain, quickly buried. The stable boy Danny peeked out from behind the water trough where he'd been cleaning bridles. At 14, he was all arms and legs and nervous energy, but his eyes held wisdom beyond his years. Those eyes found Wicasa and held them for a moment, a silent communication, born of shared outsider status in a town that had little patience for either orphans or Indians. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though the sky remained a pitiless blue. The sound seemed to rise from the earth itself, as if the land were warning of something terrible approaching. Hazel's world had collapsed 18 months ago when her husband Marcus fell from his horse during a routine cattle drive. The fall itself shouldn't have been fatal, he'd taken worse spills before, but something about this one was different. The horse came back, riderless foam around its mouth and wild terror in its eyes. They found Marcus 3 days later at the bottom of Red Canyon, his neck broken. The other riders claimed they'd seen nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing. But Hazel had noticed the way they avoided her eyes at the funeral, the way they fumbled with their hats and mumbled their condolences. Without Marcus's protection, the vultures circled quickly. The bank called in loans that had never existed. Neighbors who'd shared Sunday dinners suddenly remembered debts that had never been owed. Within months, Hazel found herself evicted from the small ranch she'd called home, forced to survive in a lean-to on the outskirts of town, with nothing but her baby and the clothes on her back. The women of Prosperity whispered behind fans and gloved hands about the fallen woman and her bastard child, though Tommy had been born in wedlock with a certificate to prove it. But facts mattered little when reputation was currency, and Hazel's had been systematically destroyed by forces she couldn't identify or fight. Wicasa's story was different, but no less painful. He'd come to Prosperity 5 years ago, following rumors of work at the new silver mine. But the mine owners preferred Mexican laborers who worked for less and complained even quieter than Indians. He'd found odd jobs where he could breaking horses for men who wouldn't shake his hand, tracking escaped cattle for ranchers who paid him half what they'd pay a white man. The trading post incident had happened 3 years back. Young Danny had been bitten by a diamondback while collecting eggs behind the general store. The boy lay dying his leg, swollen black, while the town doctor was drunk in the saloon and couldn't be roused. Wicasa had appeared like smoke, carrying herbs his grandmother had taught him to gather. He'd sucked the poison from the wound-applied poultices and sat with the boy through 3 days of fever delirium. When Danny recovered, the town grudgingly allowed Wicasa to stay, though they made sure he knew his place. That place was always on the margins, always looking in from the outside. But it gave him a perfect view of the town's secrets, and Sheriff Finch had many secrets. Finch had arrived 2 years ago with impeccable credentials and a federal appointment. He'd cleaned up the previous sheriff's corruption, or so everyone believed. What they didn't see were the children who disappeared from the outlying farms, orphans mostly, or kids whose parents had died in accidents that seemed increasingly common. The official reports cited wolves' wagon accidents, cholera. But Wicasa had seen the tracks around those scenes, boot prints that didn't belong, horses that had been there when they shouldn't have been. He'd also noticed something else, the way Finch sometimes stood when he thought no one was watching, one hand pressed to his chest, as if touching something beneath his shirt. The gesture was unconscious, almost reverent, like a man fingering a treasured locket or photograph. The accusation came like lightning from a clear sky. Mrs. Shepley's voice cut across the market square with the force of a cavalry charge. "Thief, that woman stole my silver thimble." Every head turned toward Hazel, who stood frozen beside the vegetable stand with Tommy whimpering in her arms. Mrs. Shepley, the banker's wife and unofficial queen of Prosperity's social hierarchy, pointed a diamond-ringed finger like a weapon. Her face flushed with righteous indignation beneath her elaborate hat. "I saw her sneak it into her shawl when she thought I wasn't looking." Mrs. Shepley continued her voice, carrying the authority of someone who'd never been questioned. "Search her, Sheriff. Search her now." Finch moved with the lazy confidence of a man who'd done this dance many times before. "You heard the lady, Mrs. Moore. Empty your pockets." "I didn't take anything." Hazel protested, but her hands shook as she shifted Tommy to one arm and turned her shawl inside out. Nothing fell out but dust and a few dried wildflowers, pathetic decorations she'd gathered to brighten Tommy's world. "Check her basket." Mrs. Shepley insisted, her voice rising to a pitch that made several dogs whine. "Check her baby's blanket. These people hide things everywhere." Finch's search was thorough and humiliating. He dumped out Hazel's small basket, scattering the few scraps of food she'd managed to find. He unwrapped Tommy's blanket despite the baby's fevered cries, shaking it out, while Hazel stood helpless and exposed. When he found nothing, his expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "Must have hidden it somewhere else," he said finally. "Or maybe she's got accomplices." His gaze swept the crowd with predatory interest. "Can't be too careful with thieves. They work in gangs, you know." "But you found nothing," Hazel said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Doesn't that proves you're cleverer than most?" Finch's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "But not clever enough? There's been a rash of thefts lately. Valuable items going missing from decent homes. Pattern suggests someone who knows the town knows when folks are away." He gestured toward Tommy. "Someone desperate enough to risk everything." The crowd murmured agreement. Mrs. Henderson nodded sagely. "Always knew she was trouble. You can see it in the eyes." "I'm arresting you on suspicion of theft," Finch announced, producing iron shackles from his belt. The boy can stay in jail with you until someone claims him. If no one does. He shrugged. Well, we've got arrangements for orphans. The word arrangements hit Hazel like a physical blow. She'd heard whispers about children who disappeared, about families in the East who paid good money for young workers. Tommy was barely 2 years old, but in a world where childhood was a luxury few could afford, even toddlers had value. As the shackles clicked around her wrists, Hazel caught sight of Wicasa at the crowd's edge. Their eyes met for just a moment, and she saw something there that gave her the first glimmer of hope she'd felt in months. Recognition, understanding, and a promise of action. Thunder rolled across the sky again, closer now, and the first fat raindrops began to spatter the dust. The Prosperity Jail was a stone box, built to bake men's souls in summer and freeze their bones in winter. 2 cells faced each other across a narrow corridor, separated by iron bars thick as a man's thumb. Hazel sat on the single wooden bench in the larger cell, rocking Tommy as his fever climbed higher. The baby's skin felt like fire against her chest, and his breathing came in shallow, rapid pants that sent panic through her veins. "Please," she called through the bars to Deputy Morrison, a thick-shouldered man who chewed tobacco and spat the juice into a brass spittoon with metronomic precision. "My baby needs a doctor. He's burning up." Morrison glanced up from his dime novel long enough to spit. "Doc Hamilton don't treat criminals. Should have thought about that before you started stealing." "I didn't steal anything," Mrs. Shepley was lying. "Sure she was." Morrison's laugh was like gravel in a tin cup. "Banker's wife got nothing better to do than make up stories about trash like you." The storm arrived with biblical fury. Rain hammered the jail's tin roof like bullets, and lightning split the sky in jagged veins of white fire. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, turning the stone walls into sweating ice. But even the storm's violence couldn't mask the sound of Tommy's labored breathing. Hazel found herself humming a lullaby her mother had sung, words coming back unbidden from memories she'd tried to bury. It was an old song, part English and part something else, Cherokee maybe, or Creek. Her mother had been secretive about her own heritage, claiming to be Spanish. When people asked, though, her features suggested otherwise. The song spoke of safe harbors and distant shores of mothers who watched over their children even after death. She was midway through the second verse when a voice from the shadows made her heart stop. Mama used to sing that song. Sheriff Finch emerged from the corridor's darkness like a specter, his pale eyes reflecting the lightning flashes. He moved quietly for such a large man, boots making no sound on the stone floor. In his hand he carried a small silver locket on a tarnished chain. "Recognize this?" He held the locket up to the lamplight, and Hazel felt the blood drain from her face. She knew that piece, had seen it around her mother's neck every day until the fever took her. Inside would be a lock of dark hair and a faded photograph of a young woman with sad eyes. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. Finch's smile was all predator. "Took it off her body before they buried her in Potter's Field. Nobody else wanted it. Nobody else remembered her." He opened the locket, revealing exactly what Hazel had expected to see. Funny thing about mothers, they always have secrets, like the fact that she had 2 children, not 1. The truth hit Hazel like a physical blow. The familiar way he held his shoulders, the nervous habit of drumming his fingers, the pale eyes that matched her own. "Edmund," she breathed, using the name she hadn't spoken in 20 years. "Sheriff Finch now," he corrected, snapping the locket shut. Amazing what a man can become when he's not dragged down by family shame. When he doesn't have to explain why his mother was a half-breed whore who sold herself to travelers. She wasn't what a whore, then explain how she kept us fed when there was no husband around. Explain the men who came and went from our cabin at all hours. His voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. I remember them, Hazel. I remember their hands on her, their laughter, the way she'd cry after they left. You were just a child. You didn't understand. I understood enough. He tucked the locket back inside his shirt. Enough to know that blood don't make family. Enough to know that some people deserve better than the gutter they were born in, and some don't. Thunder crashed overhead, and Tommy's crying took on a desperate edge that made Hazel's milk let down in useless sympathy. She pressed the baby closer, feeling his fever spike higher. Edmund, please. Whatever happened between us, whatever you think of me, Tommy is innocent. He needs medicine. Tommy won't be needing anything much longer, Finch said conversationally. Neither will you. See, I've got buyers coming through tomorrow. Well-dressed folks from back east who pay good money for healthy young stock. The baby might bring $50 if he lives through the night. Course at this rate. He shrugged. You can't be serious. Can't I? Hell, Hazel, I've been at this for 2 years now. Orphans, mostly kids nobody misses. But times are hard, and folks are getting less particular about where their workers come from. He leaned against the bars close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath. Your husband figured it out, you know. Started asking questions about the Garrett boy, the McClellan girl. Smart man, your Marcus. Too smart for his own good. The implications crashed over her like ice water. You killed him. I protected my business interests. Same thing I'm doing now. He straightened, adjusting his gun belt. Get some sleep, sister. Tomorrow's going to be a big day. As his footsteps faded into the storm's fury, Hazel collapsed onto the bench, clutching Tommy as her world dissolved around her. Her brother, her own blood, had murdered her husband and was planning to sell her baby into slavery. The realization was so monstrous, so beyond the boundaries of human decency, that her mind simply refused to process it. But Tommy's fevered whimpers brought her back to the immediate crisis. Whatever Edmund had become, whatever evil he'd embraced her son, was dying in her arms. And somewhere in the storm, she had to believe that help was coming. Wicasa moved through the storm like water through stone, silent and unstoppable. The rain had turned Prosperity's streets into rivers of mud, and the wind howled between buildings with enough force to knock a man flat. Perfect conditions for what he had to do. He found Danny in the stable huddled between 2 horses for warmth while he listened to their nervous whickering. The boy looked up with startled eyes as Wicasa appeared in the doorway, water streaming from his long coat. You came, Danny said, and something in his voice suggested he'd been waiting. You know why I'm here? Danny nodded, wiping his nose on his sleeve. The woman and her baby. Sheriff's got them locked up tight. Morrison's guarding them, and he's mean as a stepped-on snake when he's been drinking. What else do you know? The boy's eyes went dark. Things I ain't supposed to know. Things I seen and wish I hadn't. He glanced toward the stable door, making sure they were alone. Sheriff's got visitors coming tomorrow. Folks in fancy clothes who don't talk much and pay in gold. They take kids, Mr. Wicasa. Take 'em and they don't never come back. Wicasa felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it real in a way that turned his stomach. How many children? Don't rightly know. Dozen, maybe more over the past year. Sheriff, he picks the ones nobody'll miss, orphans, kids from farms way out in the territory. But he's getting bolder. Word is, he's got debts need paying. Thunder crashed overhead, and both horses stamped nervously. Wicasa laid a calming hand on the nearest one's neck, feeling its heartbeat beneath his palm. I need a distraction. Something big enough to draw Morrison away from the jail. Danny grinned, showing teeth too old for his young face. "I got just the thing. These horses been spooked all day by the storm. Won't take much to send 'em running through town. Especially if someone was to say accidentally leave all the stall doors open and maybe fire off a pistol shot or two. That's dangerous work for a boy. So's living in a town where kids disappear." Danny's expression hardened. "Besides, you saved my life once. Figure it's time I return the favor." They shook hands on it, a solemn ritual that felt strangely like a military commission. Then Wicasa melted back into the storm, leaving Danny to his preparations. The jail sat at the end of Main Street like a granite tumor, its single window glowing yellow against the black night. Wicasa circled it twice, noting the positions of the guards and the layout of the building, the best approaches and escape routes. Morrison sat inside, feet up on his desk rifle within easy reach. Through the window, Wicasa could see Hazel in her cell rocking her baby, while tears streamed down her face. He'd seen that look before, on another woman's face, in another time. His own mother holding his sister's body after the soldiers finished with her. The memory still came to him in dreams, the way her eyes had gone empty, as if her soul had fled, rather than witness what men could do to innocence. That was the night he'd made his first kill a drunken sergeant who'd bragged about his conquest. Wicasa had been 15 then, more boy than man. But something had broken inside him that would never heal. The sergeant's death hadn't brought his sister back, hadn't filled the hollow place in his mother's eyes. It had only added weight to the darkness he carried. But this time would be different. This time he might actually save someone. The sound of stampeding horses erupted from the far end of town like thunder given flesh. Shouts and gunshots followed along with the crash of overturning wagons and splintering wood. Morrison jumped up from his desk, grabbing his rifle and hat. What in hell? He peered out the window, then cursed inventively. "Damn horses got loose, sheriff's gonna have my hide if anything happens to his prisoners." He hesitated for a moment, torn between duty and curiosity. Then another crash echoed through the night, followed by a woman's scream, and Morrison made his choice. He locked the jail door behind him and ran toward the chaos, leaving his keys hanging on a hook by the desk. Wicasa waited 30 seconds and then moved. The jail's back window was small, but not barred an oversight that spoke to Finch's arrogance. A few minutes with his knife loosened the frame enough to squeeze through, though he left skin on the rough wood in the process. Hazel looked up as he appeared in the corridor, her eyes wide with desperate hope. "You came." "Danny's buying us time, but not much." He grabbed Morrison's keys and unlocked her cell. "Can you travel?" "Tommy's burning up. I think he's dying." Wicasa touched the baby's forehead and felt his heart sink. The fever was high dangerous and getting worse. "We'll get him help, but first we have to get out of here." They slipped out through the window into the storm's embrace. The chaos at the other end of town continued, but Wicasa knew it wouldn't last long. Soon Morrison would realize his prisoners were gone, and then Finch would unleash hell. "Where can we go?" Hazel asked, clutching Tommy against her chest as they stumbled through the mud. "I know a place. Old station on the Underground Railroad. Might still have supplies." He took her arm, steadying her, as they made their way toward the edge of town. "But first tell me about Sheriff Finch. You knew him before he came here." Hazel's step faltered. "He's my brother. Half-brother, anyway. I thought he was dead." The revelation hit Wicasa like a physical blow. Brothers killing brothers, it was the oldest story in the world and the most bitter. "What happened between you?" "We were separated when I was 7. Our mother died and the church split us up. He went to a boys' home in Kansas City. I went to foster families. Her voice was barely audible over the storm. I never saw him again, never even knew what name he took. Until tonight. Until tonight. She pressed her face against Tommy's fevered head. How could he become this? How could blood turn so cold? Wicasa had no answer. He'd seen too much of the world's darkness to be surprised by human cruelty, but family betrayal still had the power to wound him. His own sister had died, partly because he'd trusted the wrong people, believed that blood meant loyalty. It was a mistake he'd never make again. They reached the abandoned station as the storm began to break. The building was half collapsed, its roof caved in and walls blackened by old fires. But the cellar was intact, hidden beneath a tangle of collapsed beams and prairie grass. Wicasa had discovered it months ago while tracking rustlers, and he'd made note of its potential. The cellar was dry and warm, stocked with blankets and canned goods left by conductors decades ago. Wicasa lit a small fire, while Hazel laid Tommy on a makeshift bed, his breathing shallow and rapid. "He's getting worse," she whispered. Wicasa knelt beside them, pulling herbs from his coat pocket. "My grandmother's medicine. It might help." He began brewing tea over the fire, filling the cellar with a sharp green smell. "But I need to know, does your brother have any weaknesses? Anything we can use against him?" Hazel thought for a long moment, watching Tommy's labored breathing. He loved our mother more than anything. Even after she died, he kept a piece of her dress in his pocket. Said it smelled like home. She looked up at Wicasa with haunted eyes. "But that boy is gone. What's left is something else entirely." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but Wicasa could hear something else beneath the thunder, the sound of horses approaching at a gallop. Finch had discovered their escape faster than expected. "They're coming," he said quietly. "We need to move." The abandoned station wasn't just a relic of the Underground Railroad. It was a fortress of secrets buried beneath decades of prairie grass and forgotten history. As Wicasa led them deeper into the cellar, Hazel noticed something that made her blood run cold. Children's drawings scratched into the stone walls. "Jesus," she whispered, tracing a crude figure of a woman with tears falling from her eyes. "How many?" "Too many." Wicasa's voice was grim as he studied the markings. Some were fresh made with charcoal or pencil. Others had been carved deep into the stone with fingernails or broken glass. This isn't just a hiding place. It's a way station. The implications crashed over them both. Edmund Sheriff Finch had been using the old station as a holding point for kidnapped children before shipping them east. The cellar they'd sought for refuge was actually the heart of his operation. "We have to get out of here," Hazel said, clutching Tommy tighter as his fever spiked again. But as she turned toward the entrance, she saw Wicasa frozen in place, staring at something carved into the far wall. The name Mary Crowfeather was scratched deep into the stone, surrounded by a crude drawing of mountains and a setting sun. Below it, in a child's uncertain handwriting, "Mama will come for me." "Your sister?" Hazel asked softly. Wicasa nodded, unable to speak. Mary had been taken by soldiers when she was 12, supposedly moved to a mission school in the East. But she'd never arrived. For 15 years he'd wondered what happened to her, imagined her growing up safe among strangers. Now he knew the truth. She'd died here in this hole, waiting for a rescue that never came. The sound of horses grew louder, accompanied by shouts and the jingle of spurs. Finch's voice cut through the storm like a blade. "They can't have gone far. Check every building, every hole in the ground. There's another way out." Wicasa said, his voice steady despite the rage burning in his eyes. "Tunnel that leads to the old mine shaft." But it's narrow, and with the baby, I can do it. Hazel's voice carried new determination. She'd been running from Edmund's shadow her whole life, never understanding the source of her nightmares. Now she knew, and knowing gave her strength. Whatever it takes. The tunnel was barely 3 feet high, carved through solid rock by desperate hands decades ago. They crawled through darkness, thick as molasses, guided only by Wicasa's memory of the route. Tommy's labored breathing echoed off the walls, and twice they had to stop when his fevered crying threatened to give away their position. Behind them, they could hear Morrison's voice. "Sheriff, found something down here. Fresh tracks, still warm ashes. Then find them." Finch's rage was volcanic. "I don't care if you have to tear this whole place apart stone by stone." They emerged from the tunnel at the base of Red Canyon, where the old mine shaft gaped like a wound in the earth. The storm was breaking, but fingers of lightning still clawed at the sky. In the distance, Prosperity glowed with torchlight as the whole town turned out for the hunt. "They'll find the tunnel soon," Wicasa said, studying the landscape with tactical eyes. "We need to move fast." But as they started to climb toward higher ground, Tommy's breathing suddenly stopped. For one terrible moment, Hazel thought she'd lost him. Then he gasped, his tiny body convulsing, and began to cry with a sound that was barely human. "The fever's breaking," Wicasa said, touching the baby's forehead. "But he's still in danger. We need to get him to a real doctor. Dr. Hamilton won't treat us. You know that." "Not Hamilton, but there's someone else." Wicasa's expression was grim. "Danny mentioned visitors coming to town tomorrow. Folks in fancy clothes who pay in gold. What if one of them is a doctor?" The idea was both brilliant and insane. The very people coming to buy children might be their only hope of saving Tommy's life. But it would mean going back into the lion's den, confronting Edmund on his own ground. "It's too dangerous," Hazel said. But even as she spoke, she knew they had no choice. Tommy was dying in her arms, and every minute they spent running was a minute closer to losing him forever. "Danny," Wicasa said suddenly. "He's still in town, still in danger. If Finch figures out he helped us." They looked at each other across the growing light of dawn, understanding passing between them without words. This wasn't just about escape anymore. It was about justice, about standing up to evil, about protecting the innocent, no matter the cost. "What do you need me to do?" Hazel asked. By morning, Prosperity hummed with nervous energy. Word of the jailbreak had spread like wildfire, and groups of armed men clustered on street corners, sharing whispered theories and casting suspicious glances at anyone who looked out of place. Sheriff Finch had posted a $100 reward for information leading to the fugitives' capture, more money than most townspeople saw in a year. But beneath the surface excitement, something else was building. Children had been disappearing for months, and now people were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. Mrs. Patterson cornered Dr. Hamilton outside the pharmacy, demanding to know why he'd never examined little Billy Ferguson's accident properly. Old Man Crawford mentioned seeing unmarked wagons leaving town at odd hours, always heading east toward the railroad. Danny worked in the stable, keeping his head down and his ears open. He'd already heard 3 different versions of the night's events, each more dramatic than the last. According to the stories, Hazel was everything from a dangerous outlaw to a witch who'd hexed the horses into stampeding. But Danny knew the truth, and he was watching for his chance to act. That chance came when Mrs. Shepley arrived at the stable, demanding her best carriage be prepared for important visitors. She was dressed in her finest silk, dripping with jewelry that caught the morning light like broken glass. "And mind you, clean it properly," she snapped at Danny, dropping a silver dollar into his palm. "These are important people. They don't associate with common trash." "Yes, ma'am," Danny said, pocketing the coin. "What kind of important people?" Mrs. Shepley's chest swelled with self-importance. Philanthropists from Boston. They're here to adopt orphans, give them proper Christian homes, instead of leaving them to rot in this godforsaken territory. She leaned closer, her breath smelling of lavender water and barely concealed excitement. One of them is a doctor. Dr. Pemberton. He's particularly interested in healthy young specimens. The word specimens made Danny's skin crawl, but he kept his expression neutral. Sounds like good Christian work, ma'am. Indeed it is. The Lord provides for those who serve His will. She swept toward the door, then paused. Oh, and boy, if you see any sign of that thieving woman and her bastard, you report it immediately. Sheriff Finch has plans for them that don't involve gentle Christian charity. After she left, Danny slumped against the stable wall, feeling the weight of knowledge settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He'd been right about the visitors, but now he knew something else. Mrs. Shepley was involved up to her diamond-encrusted neck. The righteous Christian act was just that, an act. He was still processing this revelation when a shadow fell across the stable door. Wicasa stood there dressed in clean clothes that made him look more like a traveling merchant than a wanted fugitive. You came back, Danny whispered. Had to. The baby's dying and we need Dr. Pemberton to look at him. Wicasa stepped inside, scanning the stable for threats. But first, I need you to do something for me. Anything. I need you to get into Sheriff Finch's office and find his records. There should be Ledger's correspondence, something that proves what he's been doing. Wicasa's eyes were hard as flint. People are starting to ask questions, but they need proof. Real evidence they can't ignore. Danny nodded, understanding the risks. If he was caught, Finch would probably kill him, or worse, ship him off with the next batch of orphans. But he'd seen what happened to kids who disappeared from prosperity, and he wasn't about to let it continue. Where's Mrs. Moore and her baby? Hidden near the old mine. But not for long. Finch is getting desperate, and desperate men make mistakes. We're going to force his hand. How? Wicasa's smile was sharp as a scalping knife. By giving him exactly what he wants. Dr. Pemberton arrived on the noon stage, accompanied by 2 associates who radiated the kind of quiet menace usually associated with professional killers. All 3 wore expensive Eastern clothes and carried themselves with the confidence of men who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. Pemberton himself was a small, neat man with surgeon's hands and eyes like chips of winter ice. Sheriff Finch met them at the hotel with all the ceremony due to visiting dignitaries. He'd shaved and pressed his uniform, even polished his boots. But Danny, watching from the stable across the street, could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his hand kept drifting toward his gun. Gentlemen, Finch said, shaking hands with practiced political warmth. Welcome to prosperity. I trust your journey wasn't too arduous. Tolerable. Pemberton replied, his Boston accent cutting through the prairie air like a blade. Though I understand you've had some complications since our last correspondence. Finch's smile tightened. Nothing that can't be handled. A minor security breach, but the merchandise remains intact. Excellent. My clients are quite specific about their requirements. Fresh stock properly documented, no inconvenient questions from local authorities. Pemberton adjusted his spectacles. I assume the usual arrangements are in place. Of course, though I should mention one of our recent acquisitions has developed a fever. May require medical attention before transport. Pemberton's eyes sharpened with professional interest. How recent an acquisition? Very recent. Mother and child, excellent breeding potential. The woman is young, healthy, proven fertile. The child is... Finch paused, weighing his words. Spirited. I see. Pemberton exchanged glances with his associates. Well, Perhaps we should examine the merchandise immediately. Time is money, after all. As the group moved toward the jail, Danny slipped out the stable's back door and ran for the sheriff's office. The building was empty, except for a half-drunk deputy who was snoring at his desk. Danny had cleaned the office many times as part of his stable duties, so he knew exactly where Finch kept his private papers. The desk drawer was locked, but Danny had learned to pick locks from a gambler who'd wintered in the stable 2 years back. The mechanism clicked open on his second try, revealing a leather portfolio stuffed with correspondence receipts and ledgers. What he found inside made his blood run cold. Letters from placement agencies in Boston and New York discussing inventory levels and shipping schedules. Receipts for children sold like cattle with prices that varied based on age, health, and tractability. A master ledger listing dozens of names, ages, and disposal dates going back 2 years. But the most damning evidence was a telegram, dated just 3 days ago. Pemberton arriving noon, stage stop need 12 units, ages 5-15, stop premium prices for healthy females, stop no questions asked, stop. Danny was stuffing the papers into his shirt when he heard voices in the street outside. Finch's laugh, cold and calculating, followed by Pemberton's cultured tones discussing quality control. They were coming back. He managed to get the drawer locked and was pretending to sweep the floor when they entered. Finch barely glanced at him, but Pemberton's eyes missed nothing. For a moment, Danny was certain the doctor could see right through him, could read guilt in every line of his face. "Industrious lad," Pemberton observed. "How old would you say he is, Sheriff?" 14, maybe 15. Hard to tell with his type. Finch's voice carried casual cruelty. "Orphan, no family, nobody to miss him. Perfect candidate for our program." Danny felt ice in his veins, but he kept sweeping, kept his expression neutral. They were talking about him like he wasn't there, discussing his future like he was livestock. Pemberton studied Danny with the same clinical interest he might show a laboratory specimen. Strong shoulders, good teeth. Yes, he'd do nicely for the Colorado operation. Mining companies pay well for sturdy boys. Consider it a bonus, then. No extra charge. Finch moved to his desk, and for one terrifying moment, Danny thought he'd noticed the slightly disturbed papers. But the sheriff was focused on other things, pulling out a bottle of whiskey and 3 glasses. 2 successful partnerships. Danny slipped out while they were drinking, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had the evidence, but now he was marked for shipment himself. Worse, he'd overheard enough to know that Finch was planning something special for Hazel and Tommy, something that involved Pemberton's personal attention. He had to warn Wicasa. But as he headed for the rendezvous point, he saw Morrison and 2 other deputies spreading out through town, checking every building, every hiding place. The net was closing fast. The abandoned mine shaft had once been Prosperity's ticket to wealth, a silver vein that promised to transform the dusty frontier town into a glittering metropolis. But the vein had played out after 18 months, leaving behind only a honeycomb of tunnels and broken dreams. Now it served as the perfect hiding place for the town's most wanted fugitives. Hazel crouched in the deepest chamber, rocking Tommy as his fever finally began to break. The herbal medicine Wicasa had brewed was working but slowly, and the baby was still dangerously weak. Every breath was a struggle, every movement a triumph of will over failing flesh. "Mama's here." She whispered the words, echoing off the stone walls like a prayer. "Mama won't let them hurt you." But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if they were true. What could one woman do against her brother's network of corruption? Edmund had the law on his side, the town's respect, and enough firepower to level half of Prosperity, if necessary. She had nothing but a dying baby, and the help of 2 outcasts, a Lakota warrior haunted by his sister's death, and a stable boy who'd already risked everything. The sound of approaching footsteps made her heart stop. But it was Wicasa who appeared in the tunnel entrance, his face grim with new intelligence. "Danny got the evidence," he said without preamble. "Finch has been selling children for 2 years. Pemberton's here to make the biggest purchase yet, 12 kids, including Tommy. And us. Your special merchandise. Pemberton's interested in breeding stock for his clients. Healthy young women who can produce more inventory." Wicasa's voice was flat, emotionless, but she could see the rage burning in his eyes. "He's already examined 3 other women. None of them survived the selection process." Hazel felt something break inside her, the last vestige of hope, maybe, or the final chain of civilized restraint. She looked down at Tommy's fevered face and made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days ago. "I'm going to kill him," she said quietly. "Which one?" "Both of them. Edmund first, then Pemberton, then anyone else who's hurt children." She looked up at Wicasa with eyes that held no sanity, only purpose. "I won't let Tommy grow up in a world where monsters like that exist." Wicasa studied her for a long moment, recognizing something he'd seen in his own reflection too many times. "Killing them won't bring back the children they've taken." "No. But it might save the ones they haven't taken yet." Before he could respond, Danny came scrambling through the tunnel, his face white with terror. "They're coming. Finch figured out where you're hiding. He's bringing dogs, and Pemberton wants to examine the baby, personally." The sound of baying hounds echoed through the mine shaft, growing closer by the second. Hazel stood up, settling Tommy against her shoulder with practiced ease. In the lamplight, she looked like a Madonna carved from granite, beautiful, implacable, and utterly without mercy. "How long do we have?" she asked. 10 minutes, maybe less." Danny was breathing hard, sweat beading on his young face. "There's something else. Mrs. Shepley's involved. She's been helping pick the children, getting a cut of the profits." The news hit Hazel like a physical blow. Mrs. Shepley, who'd accused her of theft, who'd set this whole nightmare in motion, she was part of the conspiracy. Every child who disappeared, every family destroyed, she'd had a hand in it all. "The tunnel that leads to the old station," Wicasa said, checking his weapons. "Can we get there before they block it off?" "Not with the baby," Danny said. "He'll cry, 'Give us away.' And Mrs. Shepley knows about that tunnel. She mentioned it once when she was drunk on communion wine." The baying grew louder, closer. Soon they would be trapped like rats in a hole with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. But as Hazel looked around the stone chamber that had become their sanctuary, she noticed something she'd missed before. Carved into the wall above their heads was a symbol she recognized from her mother's stories, a Cherokee marking that meant safe passage. Below it, scratched in a child's uncertain hand, were the words, "Mama came for me." "Your sister," she said to Wicasa. "She got out, didn't she? She escaped." Wicasa stared at the marking, understanding flooding his features. "The symbol, it's a trail marker. She left directions." Following the carved arrows, they discovered a narrow passage hidden behind a curtain of mineral deposits. It was barely wide enough for one person, and it led not toward the surface, but deeper into the mountain's heart. "Where does it go?" Hazel asked. "Only one way to find out," Wicasa replied. "But first, Danny, take this." He pressed the evidence portfolio into the boy's hands. "Get it to someone in authority. Federal marshal, territorial judge, anyone who's not in Finch's pocket." "What about you?" "We're going to end this, one way or another." As they squeezed into the hidden passage, the sound of dogs and men echoed through the main chamber behind them. Finch's voice carried clearly in the stone acoustics. "They were here. Tracks are fresh. Find them." But Hazel was no longer listening. She was following her son's fevered breathing and her mother's Cherokee blood through passages carved by desperate hands toward a confrontation that would define not just her future, but the soul of prosperity itself. The hidden passage led them through the mountain's bowels like a birth canal carved in stone. They crawled for what felt like hours through spaces barely wide enough for human bodies, guided only by Cherokee trail markers that glowed faintly in their lamplight. Tommy's breathing had steadied, but he remained weakly conscious, his fever-bright eyes reflecting the flame like captured stars. When they finally emerged, it was into a world transformed. They stood on a ledge overlooking prosperity from the east, the entire town spread out below them like a map of corruption. But something was wrong with the picture. Smoke rose from multiple buildings, and crowds of people moved through the streets with the purposeful urgency of revolution. "Danny did it," Wicasa said, pointing toward the courthouse where a large crowd had gathered. "He got the evidence to someone who mattered." Through Wicasa's telescope, they could see federal marshals in distinctive blue uniforms surrounding the sheriff's office. Finch and his deputies were nowhere to be seen, but Pemberton's fancy carriage was overturned in the street, its contents scattered like expensive garbage. "It's over," Hazel whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "The nightmare's over." But even as she spoke, movement caught her eye. A group of horsemen was riding hard out of town, heading for the Badlands where territorial law held little sway. Through the telescope, she could make out Finch's distinctive figure in the lead, followed by Morrison and two other men. "He's running," she said. "Let him run. Justice will catch up eventually." But Hazel shook her head, settling Tommy more securely in her arms. "No, not eventually. Now. He killed my husband. He stole God knows how many children. He would have sold my baby like livestock." Her voice carried a finality that made Wicasa's blood run cold. Some debts can't be paid with jail time. She turned toward the trail that led down to the valley, but Wicasa caught her arm. "This isn't the way. Killing him won't make you feel better. I know I've tried. This isn't about feeling better. It's about making sure he never hurts another child." She looked at him with eyes that held depths of pain he couldn't fathom. "He's my brother, Wicasa. My blood. Which means his crimes are partly mine to bear, and partly mine to answer for." Before he could stop her, she pressed Tommy into his arms and started down the mountain path. The baby looked up at him with solemn eyes, as if understanding that his fate now rested with this scarred Lakota warrior who'd already lost too much to violence. "Damn," Wicasa muttered and then followed her into the Valley of Shadows. They caught up with Finch's group at Devil's Crossroads, where four valleys met in a natural amphitheater of red stone. The fugitives had stopped to rest their horses, confident that no pursuit could follow them through the maze of canyons and mesas that stretched to the horizon. They were wrong. Hazel approached the camp directly, walking down the main trail with Tommy in her arms, like a woman out for a Sunday stroll. The boldness of it froze the outlaws in place, who walks openly into a nest of killers except someone with nothing left to lose. "Hello, Edmund," she called out when she was 50 yards away. "I think it's time we had a family reunion." Finch rose from beside the campfire, his hand dropping instinctively to his gun. But something in her bearing some fundamental shift in her presence made him hesitate. This wasn't the broken woman he'd terrorized in jail. This was something else entirely, something dangerous. "I told you to call me Sheriff," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "You told me a lot of things, most of them lies." She stopped just outside the circle of firelight, close enough to talk, but far enough to avoid a quick grab. "But I've been thinking about the truth, Edmund. About our mother. about what really happened in that cabin all those years ago. You don't know what you're talking about. Don't I? I remember the men too, Edmund. The ones who came at night. But I also remember something you've chosen to forget. They weren't customers. They were her brothers. Uncle William, Uncle Sam, Uncle Joseph. Coming to check on us, to bring food when times were hard, to make sure their sister's children were safe. The words hit Finch like physical blows. Morrison and the other deputies exchanged glances, sensing something significant, but not understanding what. Tommy stirred in Hazel's arms, letting out a soft cry that echoed off the canyon walls. "You're lying," Finch said, but his voice cracked like a 15-year-old boy's. "Am I then explain why they always brought gifts? Why they stayed to talk, to tell stories, to teach us Cherokee words? Why they cried at her funeral?" Hazel's voice grew stronger with each word. "Our mother wasn't a whore, Edmund. She was a grieving widow trying to raise 2 children alone, and her brothers were the only family we had left." The truth hung in the air, like smoke changing everything and nothing. Finch's entire adult life had been built on a foundation of shame and hatred for a woman who deserved neither. Every crime he'd committed, every child he'd sold, every life he'd destroyed, all of it, based on a lie he'd told himself to justify the unjustifiable. "Even if that's true," he said finally, "it doesn't change anything. I am what I am. You are what you are. And that baby is your nephew." The words cut through his defenses like a blade. "Your own blood. The last innocent thing in our cursed family line. And you were going to sell him like cattle." For a moment the mask slipped completely. She saw the boy he'd been, confused, angry, desperate for love, but too proud to admit it. Then the mask snapped back into place, but not quite perfectly. Cracks showed around the edges. "Sentimental nonsense," he said. "Blood doesn't make family. Money makes family. Power makes family. Love is just weakness dressed up in pretty words." "Is it? Then why do you still carry Mother's locket?" His hand went instinctively to his chest, confirming what she'd suspected. Even as a criminal and child seller, he'd kept that one precious thing. Even in his deepest corruption, some part of him remembered love. "Enough talk," Morrison interrupted, drawing his gun. "We've got marshals on our trail and a long ride ahead. Kill them both and let's go." But as Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger, Wicasa's rifle spoke from the canyon rim above. The deputy spun around and felt his blood steaming in the cool evening air. The other men scattered for cover, suddenly aware that they were trapped in a natural shooting gallery. "Just you and me now, Edmund," Hazel said, seemingly unaffected by the violence erupting around her. "The way it should have been from the beginning." Finch drew his gun, but his hand was shaking. Whether from fear, rage, or something deeper, she couldn't tell. "I'll kill you," he said. "I'll kill you and take the baby anyway." "No," she said quietly. "You won't. Because you're not a killer, Edmund. You're a coward. You hire killers. You manipulate others into doing your dirty work. But when it comes down to pulling the trigger on your own sister," she stepped closer, fearless, "you don't have it in you." His gun wavered, pointing at her chest, then at Tommy, then back again. Around them, the gunfight continued, as Wicasa picked off the remaining deputies with methodical precision. But in the eye of the storm, brother and sister faced each other across 20 years of pain and misunderstanding. "I should have killed you years ago," he whispered. "In the alley behind the orphanage. I had the chance." "What stopped you? You looked like her, like Mama." Tears tracked down his weathered cheeks. You had her eyes, her smile. Even when you were just 7 years old, you had her strength. I still do. She held out her hand. Come home, Edmund. Help me raise Tommy. Help me heal what's been broken. It's not too late. For a moment, she thought she had him. His gun hand dropped and something like hope flickered in his pale eyes. But then Tommy cried again, and the sound seemed to shatter whatever fragile thing had been building between them. It is too late, he said, raising the gun again. I've done things. Sold children younger than him. Watched them cry for their mothers while I counted money. I can't come back from that. Nobody can. Edmund. The gunshot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. But it wasn't Finch who fired. It was the last surviving deputy shooting from behind a boulder. The bullet took Hazel in the shoulder, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the ground. Tommy flew from her arms, screaming as he tumbled into the rocks. What happened next would be debated in Prosperity saloons for years to come. Some said Finch shot the deputy in a rage for harming his sister and nephew. Others claimed it was Wicasa's bullet that ended the man's life. But those closest to the truth knew better. Edmund Finch, corrupt sheriff and child seller, saved his nephew's life. As Tommy rolled toward the edge of a 50-foot drop, Finch threw himself forward, scooping up the baby with one hand while putting 3 bullets into the deputy with the other. He died with his nephew safe in his arms and his sister's blood on his hands. The last thing he said, as Hazel crawled toward them with her shoulder torn open, was, "His name's Tommy, like Uncle Tom." She nodded, unable to speak, past the pain and the grief and the terrible, beautiful irony of redemption. "Good name," Edmund whispered, pressing the baby into her good arm. "Strong name. Cherokee name." He touched the locket at his throat, then pressed it into Tommy's tiny fist. Tell him his uncle remembered how to love. At the end. By the time Wicasa reached them, Sheriff Edmund Finch was dead, and Tommy was playing with his great-grandmother's locket in the light of the setting sun. Dr. Hamilton worked on Hazel's shoulder by lamplight in his clinic, his hand steady despite the whiskey on his breath. The bullet had passed through cleanly missing bone and major blood vessels, but the wound would heal slowly and leave a scar she'd carry forever. "You're lucky," he said, not looking at her face. "Another inch to the right, and it would have hit your heart." "Would you have treated me then?" she asked quietly. "If I was dying instead of just wounded?" Hamilton's hands paused in their work. When he finally looked up, his eyes held depths of shame she hadn't expected. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'd like to think so, but I don't know." It was more honesty than she'd gotten from anyone in Prosperity for months. Maybe it was a beginning. Outside the clinic, the town was transforming. Federal marshals had arrested 12 men and women involved in the child-selling ring, including Mrs. Shepley, who'd broken down completely when confronted with the evidence. The children, who'd been scheduled for shipment 7 in total, ranging from ages 4 to 16, had been reunited with surviving family members or placed with foster families vetted by territorial authorities. But just as Hazel was learning was a complicated thing. For every person arrested, 2 more had simply disappeared into the vast Western territories. For every child saved, 3 more were already gone, sold into lives she didn't want to imagine. The network Edmund had built would take years to fully unravel, and some of its victims would never be found. Danny appeared in the clinic doorway as Hamilton finished bandaging her shoulder. The boy had been hailed as a hero by the territorial government, offered rewards and recognition that could set him up for life. But he looked older now, burdened by knowledge no 14-year-old should possess. "How's Tommy?" he asked. "Fever's broken. He'll live." She studied the boy's face. "What about you? What will you do now?" Danny shrugged, a gesture that tried to hide how lost he felt. Marshall offered to find me a good family back east, says I earned it. But I belong here. This is my home, even if it's a broken one. He looked out the window at the town he'd helped save. Someone needs to make sure this never happens again. Someone needs to watch out for the kids who got nobody else. Hazel felt something warm uncurl in her chest, the first genuine hope she'd experienced in months. That's a big responsibility for one person. Good thing I won't be alone. Danny grinned, showing teeth that were already losing their boyish gaps. Wicasa's staying too. Says he's got ghosts to lay to rest. Through the window, she could see the Lakota warrior standing in the street surrounded by townspeople who were actually listening to what he had to say. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked like he belonged somewhere. "What about you?" Danny asked. "You could go anywhere now. Start fresh." Hazel looked down at Tommy, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms for the first time in days. His fever had broken completely, and color was returning to his cheeks. In his tiny fist, he still clutched Edmund's locket, a tangible link to a heritage she'd spent her whole life running from. "I think we'll stay too," she said finally. "This town has a lot of healing to do. And Tommy deserves to grow up somewhere he can make a difference." Dr. Hamilton cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mrs. Moore, Hazel, I want you to know about not treating you when you needed help. You're treating me now," she said simply. "That's what matters." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Then he picked up his medical bag and headed for the door. "I should check on the other children. Make sure they're all healthy before their families take them home." As he left, Wicasa entered carrying a bouquet of wildflowers that looked absurdly delicate in his scarred hands. He placed them on the table beside her bed, then sat down in the chair Danny had vacated. "Found them growing by the old station," he said. "Thought Tommy might like the colors." "He will. Thank you." She studied his face, noting the lines of exhaustion around his eyes. "You found peace with your sister." "I found her final message. She did escape, made it to a Cherokee settlement in the Nations. Lived to be 37, had children of her own." His voice carried a mixture of joy and sorrow. "She never forgot me. Left instructions that if I ever came looking, I should know she was happy." "That's a beautiful gift." "Yes. And it comes with a responsibility." He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "There are other stations like this one. Other networks that prey on children. The marshals want me to help them track down the ones that are still operating. Dangerous work. The most dangerous, but necessary." He glanced at Tommy, who was making soft baby sounds in his sleep. "Children deserve to grow up safe. All children." "What about us? What about prosperity?" "Danny can handle prosperity. Kid's got more courage in his little finger than most grown men have in their whole bodies." Wicasa's expression grew serious. "But I'll be back. This town is part of me now. You're part of me now." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and promise. Hazel felt her heart beat faster, but she forced herself to think practically. "I'm not looking for a husband, Wicasa. I'm not looking for someone to take care of me." "Good. Because I'm not looking for a wife who needs taking care of." His smile was gentle but sure. "I'm looking for a partner. Someone who understands that healing the world is work that never ends." Tommy stirred in her arms, opening his eyes and looking directly at Wicasa with the serious gaze of someone far older than his years. Then he smiled his first real smile since the fever started, and reached out with one tiny hand. Wicasa took the offered hand carefully, his weathered fingers dwarfing the baby's. "Hello, little warrior," he said softly. "Ready to help us change the world?" Tommy gurgled happily. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Hazel allowed herself to believe in tomorrow. 1 year later, Prosperity had become the kind of town people pointed to as an example of what frontier justice could accomplish, when good people refused to look the other way. The new sheriff elected in a landslide was a former army captain named McKenna, who'd lost his own children to kidnappers years earlier. His first act was to establish a citizens' committee dedicated to monitoring the welfare of all children in the territory. Danny served as the committee's secretary, his experiences making him uniquely qualified to spot the warning signs of abuse and neglect. He was also attending school for the first time in his life, soaking up knowledge with the desperate hunger of someone who'd been denied education too long. The territorial government had offered him a full scholarship to study law in Denver, but he decided to wait until Prosperity was truly safe. Hazel ran a small clinic next to Dr. Hamilton's practice, specializing in treating women and children who couldn't afford traditional medical care. Her Cherokee heritage, once a source of shame and hiding, had become a source of strength as she learned traditional healing methods from tribal elders. Word spread through the territory that there was a place where anyone could find help, regardless of race or economic status. Tommy was walking now, a sturdy toddler with his father's gentle nature and his mother's stubborn determination. He spoke both English and Cherokee with equal fluency, and his favorite game was following Danny around the stable, helping with chores that usually took twice as long with his assistants. Wicasa returned every few months, each visit bringing news of another network dismantled, another group of children rescued from lives of forced labor. The work was taking its toll. He was thinner, more scarred, haunted by things he'd seen and done. But he was also more at peace than Hazel had ever seen him, as if he'd finally found his true purpose. Their relationship had deepened, slowly built on shared purpose, rather than passion, mutual respect, rather than romantic illusion. They were partners in the truest sense, united by their commitment to protecting the innocent and healing the damaged places in their world. It was during his latest visit that the letter arrived. Danny brought it to Hazel's clinic on a Tuesday morning, his face pale with worry. The envelope was expensive paper bearing a Denver postmark and the letterhead of a prestigious law firm. Inside was a single sheet of cream-colored stationery covered in precise legal handwriting. Mrs. Hazel Moore. She read aloud. We represent certain parties with interests in the territories who have been following recent events in Prosperity with considerable concern. While we applaud your community's commitment to justice, we feel compelled to inform you that the network you helped expose was merely one branch of a much larger organization. She paused, feeling ice form in her stomach. Tommy was playing on the floor beside her desk, building towers with wooden blocks and knocking them down with gleeful determination. He looked so innocent, so safe, that the letter's implications seemed impossible. Our clients, she continued reading, have suffered considerable financial losses due to your interference. They wish us to convey that while they bear no personal animosity toward you or your associates, business is business. Steps must be taken to protect their remaining investments. Threats? Danny asked. Worse than threats. They're giving us notice. She folded the letter carefully, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. They want us to know they're coming, so we have time to run. It's almost courteous. Will you run? Hazel looked at Tommy, who had stopped playing and was watching her with solemn eyes that seemed to understand far more than any 2-year-old should. Then she looked out the window at the town they'd all fought to save, the place that had become home in ways she'd never expected. No, she said finally. We won't run. We'll fight. Even if it means, especially if it means. She picked up Tommy, settling him on her hip with practiced ease. Some things are worth dying for, Danny. Some places are worth defending. Some futures are worth any price. When Wicasa returned that evening, she showed him the letter without comment. He read it twice, his expression growing darker with each word. "How long do we have?" he asked. "A month, maybe 2. They'll want to make an example, but they'll also want to be thorough." She set a cup of coffee in front of him, noting how his hands shook slightly as he reached for it. "The question is, are you ready for another war?" Wicasa stared into the coffee's dark surface, seeing reflections of past battles and future struggles. When he looked up, his eyes held the calm certainty of a man who'd found his purpose and was prepared to die for it. "I've been fighting this war my whole life," he said. "The only difference now is that I'm not fighting alone." Outside the clinic window, Prosperity's lights twinkled like earthbound stars, each one representing a life they'd helped save or protect. In the distance, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, pregnant with rain and lightning and the promise of change. Tommy reached up from his blanket on the floor, making grabbing motions toward the locket that still hung around his neck, his uncle's final gift polished bright by constant handling. Hazel lifted him up, holding him between herself and Wicasa, like a bridge between past and future, between the sins of one generation and the hopes of the next. "Whatever comes," she whispered into her son's hair, "we'll face it together. All of us." The storm broke just after midnight, filling the clinic with the sound of rain against glass and thunder rolling across the prairie like drums of war. But inside, wrapped in each other's arms and protected by love stronger than fear, they slept peacefully until dawn brought news of riders approaching from the east. The battle for Prosperity's soul was about to begin again. But this time, they were ready. This time they would win or die trying. The choice, as always, was theirs to make.